everyone. I'm Oracle Oriah, and once again, I have the pleasure of interviewing Stephen Mehler, who is hailing from Colorado, and he is going to be and has been unleashing his works from his 3 books that are just amazing, and his 55 years of studying Khemetology, and he's a wisdom teacher. He has been breaking apart and understanding the codes of human evolution. And today's topic is very dear to me, and I'm so excited. So today we're going to be talking about the human evolution of sexuality. And we will also be focusing on women in sexuality and how we have been going through the ages and how it's affected us and through patriarchy and everything. So Stephen, the platform is yours. Please take us away.
Thank you. Thank you so much. As you know, as I said, this is an extensive subject, so we'll do as much as we can today, and we'll just continue on.
Okay.
But I did want to establish, like, the general theme that we've been working on in the past, and for those that have been listening, what we've discussed before is not going to be any different than what we're discussing today. This is just a general subject that, of course, with matriarchy, with ancient Kemet, and with religion, like we discussed, is all involved in
and
this
you
subject.
have a background in women's studies.
Yes, I have a master's degree in women's studies. And in fact, in that capacity, in my second master's work, I presented a paper on the evolution of human sexuality. So that's why we're going to discuss today.
Yes.
And I wanted to use the general theme that we have established, that then again, when a human becomes self-aware, asks the questions, who am I? What am I? And where did I come from? Now today we're going to switch around these questions. Like, who am I is very objective. I think we'll do that last, because what we're going to do, I think, is bring in our own personal experiences. As we've said, we're going to classify you as not an expert, but an authority on marriage, because you've been married 5 times. Now, I've only been married once, but my background is that I am a baby boomer hippie. And so that I went through the sexual revolutions of the 60s and 70s, particularly the late 60s. But for me, the decade of the 70s. And that's what we're going to discuss in great detail. So I think when we establish this background, we can come in and talk about personal experiences, because that'll be very important. In no way would I consider myself an expert, but as we have said, I've had, again, during the 70s and into the 80s, where then it sort of changed, I had multiple relationships.
Well,
So
I really want to know if you could talk to us about how the U.S. is so puritanical compared
we will.
to Europeans.
No, it's the West in particular, West in general. So
Okay.
we will do that.
Okay.
We're going to go through in history. So, but we're going to discuss the second question. What am I, to start out? What are we? What kind of animal are we, species, et cetera, and the evolution of that. And where did I come from will be a question that we will continue to discuss. We'll discuss it today as far as evolutionary biology, who we are on this planet, but to completely discuss that subject, we will have to get into the extraterrestrial question. And we will do that in detail, I promise. But we're going to start out with biology, with embryology, with zoology. What are we? Well, to do this now, we're going to go to science. And because we deal with science, we're going to deal with labels and categories. Now, of course, when we started out, we said how my great teacher Hakim was against labels, how it limits our thinking. And this is true. But for the purpose of discussion, we have to deal with labels today, because we're classifying life itself as science is done, as a science of zoology and anthropology. So we talk about there's main groups of animals: insects, birds, reptiles, and mammals. Okay. So if we study oldest creatures are the insects. They've been here for billions of years. We haven't. Mammals haven't. So insects are the oldest. So we look at insects, and they are basically hermaphrodites. So they evolved the idea that they only needed one sex. Like our famous scarab beetle, the sign of the dawn, Khepper, is a hermaphrodite, both male and female in one creature. Mm-hmm. Insects started out that way. Then, because life is so interesting, and life always seeks diversity. but it seeks adaptability first. What will succeed as an adaptive trait? So somewhere along the line, insects did develop sexual dimorphism, male and female. And they became parthenogenetic, which we talked about. Female insects can give birth without a male. So they still maintain that hermaphrodism. But now we have, way back in prehistory, billions of years ago, the creation of the sexes, male and female. And genetically, that comes down to the chromosomes, XX being female, XY being male. But what the early studies have shown in biology, insects, and particularly birds and reptiles, which developed sexual dimorphism, male and female, it was originally thought that all creatures begin life as an embryo undifferentiated, meaning no sex. And then the XX and XY chromosome comes in and changes the creature to its sexual dimorphism. Well, this has not been found to be true. What we now know is birds and reptiles start out their life male. The embryo is decidedly male.
Interesting.
Then the X chromosome jumps in and produces what are called female estrogens, changes the creature to a female. So what is found is, if you remove the gonads, the sexual organs of a reptile or a bird, it will develop into a female 100% of the time. To a male, to a male 100% of the time. So that led some scientific credence to our creation myth of Judaism, of Exodus, of Genesis, that male was created first, which we said, of course, was not the original story. But it was then decided that mammals, when they looked at them, they were undifferentiated. They did not have that. So along came some amazing discoveries in the 40s, continued to the 50s, and particularly in the early 60s. A theory evolved in embryology called the inductor theory. And what this theory shows completely is that every mammal starts its life as a female, which means in the course of evolution, the first warm-blooded reptile, because some of them are warm-blooded. Interestingly enough, we know the dinosaurs were warm-blooded, so they weren't all reptiles. The first warm-blooded reptile that morphed genetically, a mutation into a mammal, was a female. So we all begin our life as a female. So what does that mean? Then they observed that the Y chromosome then kicks in, produces what are called fetal androgens, and that changes the organism into a male. And we now know that our male reproductive organs derived from the female, which were first. The ovaries descended, the labial folds of the vagina came out forward and formed a sac, which is the scrotal sac. The became testes, the ovaries. The clitoris, which we're going to talk much about today, the clitoris enlarged, combined with the urethral orifice, and formed a penis, a hose to deliver the sperm. That's all it was. So the male is a mutation.
That's incredible.
That's to start out right away.
That is incredible.
Only discovered in the 60s. Became real important in the 70s when I found out about it by a great lady named Lynn Margulis, and I can give you her name. She started writing about this in the 70s and produced a book on the subject. Understood now, accepted. Every mammal begins its life as a female. So, evolution of mammals. Mammals divide clearly the two sexes, male and female. The male evolves out of the female. And what we find is that the mammals had an increased sex drive, much higher than reptiles and birds. So they reproduced rapidly, and they became dominant. And we have what's called the biological imperative, which was jammed in to the male hormones, to testosterone, the extreme desire to reproduce, to copulate with a female. So there's no doubt, early times, mammals were screwing all over the planet and reproducing like crazy. So a strong drive to reproduce came from mammals. Okay. But that says that basically the act was for procreation. That's it. So then we come to the last class that we are, Primates, special group of mammals. Primates became from quadrupeds to bipedal, stood up. And that changed sexual activity. Before then, of course, as we know, observing dogs, which you have, and all animals, they all copulate with the male mounting from behind, which is normal mammalian sex. Primates changed. They were able to have sex face to face, which led to a whole other series of effects of social bonding, of feelings for the partner, so that it wasn't just a pure biological act. Now, it's argued, still argued today, whether primates enjoy sex as much as humans do.
Mm.
But what mammals evolved was a mechanism for protection. And that was that the female was not to be receptive all year long, would have what's called the estrous cycle, a period of heat, of receptivity. Now, this was necessary for the evolving mammal, because if the female was involved in giving birth and taking care of children all year long, she would be very susceptible to predation, which we were as early creatures.
Mm-hmm.
So the period of estrus would make it so that the male would not bother the female only until the period of heat receptivity. Her hormones would make her very want to have the sexual act, and then that increased reproductive ability. Because when the estrous cycle comes in, she's primed for ovulation. And in fact, the act of sex itself could cause her to ovulate and becomes, so that the act of sex and producing reproduction was very closely aligned. It's different in humans. But so, strong sex drive, a period of heat. Primates began to evolve and play with this a little bit. We know that great apes, chimpanzees, and gorillas, they have an estrous cycle, period of receptivity, but they also menstruate. They have a menstruation. Menstruate. They have a menstruation cycle also. Here's where humans diverge. Now, we're led to believe, again, the egotisticalness of humans, that we are the way we are because of the super large cerebral cortex brain. And that made us so advantageous that we became the dominant species. Only partially true. We became, first of all, I disagree with that anyway, to say that human beings are the most intelligent species on the planet. I think dolphins and whales are infinitely more superior.
I agree.
Their brains are oriented very differently than ours. They have a much more higher degree of affinity to sound than we do, et cetera, et cetera. Okay. But what did give us the advantage? Females lost, human females somewhere way back in the dim mists of prehistory, which we don't know when, because nobody wrote it down, women lost the estrous cycle. No longer a period of receptivity and heat. The human female is receptive 365 days a year. She can have sex whenever she wants. Now, there is actually a physical barrier for other mammals, even primates, for the male to even try to penetrate a female when she's not in estrus. The vaginal walls become very hard. The cells become characterized. So a male cannot penetrate a female when she's not in heat. That disappeared in the human female. Totally.
Wow.
She's receptive 365 days a year, except for the menstrual cycle, which became the dominant cycle in women. That's the 28-day cycle. Women were much more attuned to the moon, to natural cycles. Men have cycles too. We're first finally realizing this in the last 50 years, that men have monthly cycles and cycles too. But the woman's cycle was obvious with the bleeding, with the menstrual phase. So, what's that clear? And this is what you wanted to know.
Yes.
We would not have evolved orgasms if it just had stayed that way. Something else must have happened. Now, here's where the argument is. This first came up again. We're going to discuss the history of sexuality. We're going to go through Freud, Jung, Wilhelm Reich, who's very important, leading up to a very famous author of mine, who I will recommend to everybody. I have the little book here. I had to bring it up. It's called The Nature and Evolution of Female Sexuality, written in 1972 by a psychiatrist named Dr. Mary Jane Sherfy. Very important. We will return very much. This is the Bible. It hasn't been done anything since the 70s that have advanced on what she said. Okay. Now, the argument is they argue that primate females do seem to experience something of pleasure in the act, but nothing akin to what the human female experiences. So there is where we are really unique from any other species, not because of the brain, because of the genitals, because of orgasm. Now, here's the important point. The female orgasm would have never evolved from simply the act of procreation. Here's where the great argument comes in, and I'll back it up now, because this is where the confusion has come in. Western civilization, Judeo-Christian Islam, I told you, made female sexuality the devil. We're going to return to that because we have to follow. So there was no real studies, women were considered to be inferior sexual beings for the last couple thousand years. Not to have the same pleasure that men did. Men realized that there is a release of tension when you ejaculate, and sometimes there can be a concomitant orgasm pleasure. Now, here's an important point, which I'll lay out for people right now, and we'll elaborate upon later. Ejaculation and orgasm are not the same thing in the human male. Most men think it is. Most men have sex and have the tension is built up, tension, muscular, electrical tension is built up, which is a release.
Like an energetic release, right?
Exactly, of ejaculation. It is a physical response, but it is not a psychic response. The psychic response is an orgasm. Now, I'm going to go back to my own experiences later when we go talk about that to know that I know there is a difference between a man having an orgasm and ejaculating. Most men just ejaculate, and they think that's the experience because of ignorance that we discuss. Okay. So it was always assumed that men had orgasms because they ejaculate, there's a release, but women didn't. So here comes along the 19th century, and there's many, many problems that women are having, medical problems. And the medical doctors at that time have a great difficulty trying to understand it. They don't understand it. Along comes Sigmund Freud. He looks at the subject and he studies it. He said, well, this is part of my field, psychoanalysis, that there is a mental component to sexuality that we have not really discussed, not just the physical, biological component. But he was typical of his day, he was a Victorian male, and he got it wrong. But we have to give Freud credit for starting the discussion. So he would see in the problems of the patients that we brought, that once he developed the theory of psychoanalysis, and he was developing psychoanalysis, having people sit on the couch and do what's called free association. You talk, you say things, and the dreams come out. He analyzes your dreams. And he would always, in German, he would come out with his understanding. Alles ist sexual. Alles ist sexual. Alles ist sexual. What Freud was saying is, the root cause he saw of every problem, particularly of the women, but also of men, who came to him with psychological, psychoanalytic problems, was a sexual problem, basing back to when they were young. Some disturbance in the developing sexuality of the child. He then developed the stages of the development of, the adolescent phase, the anal phase, the genital phase. I'm not going to go into Freudian psychoanalysis, but he developed the phases of our development. And he says, in the genital phase, we're attached to our genitals when we're infants, we're childless, we're always touching ourselves. If we're disapproved, if it's disavowed, if the urge is sublimated, repressed, it only achieves neurosis and psychosis in his teaching. So he saw the root of all problems, psychological, being sexual. That was Freud's big adjustment.
Can I tell you, there's a part of me that has really believed in some of this on my own without even knowing he said that.
We all did. We all did.
Because
we're conditioned to believe
it. It's energy flow.
But let me continue. In fact, the word itself, women were brought to him who were said to be hysterical. Do you know the origin of the word? Hysteresis, it means the womb, the uterus. So what it means to be hysterical is a disturbance in your womb. That's how they defined it in the 19th century. Now we know men can be hysterical too. And we don't have wombs. But that's it. It was a failure of the womb. That's where hysteresis, hysterectomy, hysterical comes from. One of his first great students, Carl Gustav Jung, adopted that, but he broke with Freud. He said, no, I don't see all psychological problems having a basis in sexuality. There are other things, too, other disturbances, other traumas we go through. So he broke with Freud. Next student of Freud's was Wilhelm Reich. He loved the idea. He believed it totally. So he was going to go further than Freud. So he came up with the pleasure principle and, the theory of the orgasm, saying that the primary function of the orgasm in humans, male and female, is to reduce biological, emotional, and psychic stress.
Yep.
So Reich became the proponent that the cure to all illnesses, psychological, physical, meaning cancer, heart attack, stroke, everything, was for one to have a healthy sex life with a lot of orgasms. That was his conclusion. Now we know today it's true. Have a healthy sex life with lots of orgasms.
It'll save your life.
Will certainly make you healthier than one who does not. But we still can get cancer. We still can have heart attacks. We still can have stroke. We still can have disease, even in healthy sexual people. So again, they went overboard to try to come back. But Reich.
You were onto something though, because if you had your psychosomatic system connected to, right? Like your psychic system connected to your sexual releasing, exactly. You can have an overall wellness and raise your vibration. I could see in that sense where your health would be
without a doubt
improved.
Without a doubt. And you have a good diet and you maintain a good immune system. You should not get ill. It's true. So, but Reich was, of course, condemned. He was the sex guru, and I mean, he was telling people, have just sex is going to be to solve our problem. So he never got the popularity that either Jung, who developed transactional psychology, all of psychology is based on the work of Carl Jung and psychoanalysis on Freud, but Reich, because he had an affinity for socialism and Marxism, even though was not a Marxist per se. His works were burned in the United States, and he died in the federal penitentiary in the 50s.
Wow.
He came up with what he called the orgone. He could measure the sexual energy. He developed orgone devices. Okay. So let's continue. Reich stimulates people. So in the 40s.
Oh, he developed that machine.
Yes, the organometer.
I was hooked up to that machine. There's a few that exist, and I was privy to be in front of one, and
You're amazing.
Yeah.
And how did you respond to it? Let me hear.
It was an overall wellness because I felt more balanced and very calm.
Very good.
It was running in the room. There was a room full of people, and it was just running in the room, and they were explaining how it works, the details. I have a show I did with Dennis Strahl on quantum mysteries on this topic.
Great. The only difference that we would have now where Wilhelm Reich thought there was an actual physical sexual energy that was different from biological energy. It is the same. The basic energy we have, biological energy, is sexual, is whatever we want. It's all the same. A disturbance in that energy causes a disturbance in the physical body. No doubt about it. And a disturbance in sexuality from a young age, of course, now that we know, and this has gone on, we know that the majority of women in patriarchy for 5,000 years have been sexually abused as children. And that's why we have the problems. Remember I told you
also repression.
That's the same. It is the same.
Puritanical repression.
It is the same. Remember what I said, the great quote from George Carlin. Women are crazy and men are stupid. But the reason that women are crazy is because men are stupid. And particularly because men have been stupid about female sexuality. So here we go. The point comes then that, Freud threw up his hands at the end of his life. What do women want? He would say. He couldn't understand women. It had to take women to get involved in this field. Okay. I said I would return to Dr. Mary Jane Sherfy. Incredible human being. She's an undergraduate in the 40s. She's born in Indiana. She attends the University of Indiana. She's going for a medical degree. She's going to become a doctor. But she sees that there's an experimental course that's being offered by the University of Indiana in the early 40s, the mid 40s. It's called marriage. And it's being taught by a man who was a zoologist, who got his doctoral degree studying the physiology of gall wasps. His name was Alfred Kinsey,
What year was this?
1946.
He's the one who started talking about marriage?
He started talking about sex.
Ah.
The cover of the class, he couldn't call the class Sexology. He couldn't call the class Sexuality. He called it marriage. And it was for only medical students. It was a class in sexuality. What Kinsey did, he was an amazing statistician. He told the faculty he was going to interview over 10,000 people for this study. They laughed at him. Oh, sure. They never gave him any assistance. They never gave him any real budget. He did it all himself. This man was a fanatical workaholic, and he was, as he described, he was like the most non-plus man to teach a course in sexuality. Very straight, very Midwestern, very heterosexual, happily married, wore a crew cut and a bow tie. And he would teach the subject of sexuality like it was a class in statistics. Boring and dull, but yet the information blew her mind. Because the more he talked about his interviews, the more it was obvious that most women were not enjoying sexuality. Most American women that he studied and tested and interviewed in the 40s, overwhelming majority of them did not experience orgasm. In fact, they were confused. Why were they confused? Because of Sigmund Freud. Again, Freud did not understand female sexuality. He considered it adolescent, to be less than male. He said that in the genital stage, women, young girls, infants, are fascinated with their clitoris. They touch it, they fool with it. That's their infantile sexuality. He then said a woman must transfer her sexuality from her clitoris to her vagina to have a mature experience. Even though it was known even then in Freud's time that there are very few nerve endings in the vagina. But as Mary Jane Sherfy found out, later discovered by the people she worked with, Masters and Johnson, we will come to them, the clitoris is only one function in human evolution, and that's pleasure. Nothing else. So the sexual organ of
God for that.
the sexual organ of a woman is the clitoris. The reproductive organ is the vagina. The vagina is not the sexual organ. The only sensual nerve endings you have are in the upper third of your vagina, the very top, which is still connected to the clitoral complex. As Mary Jane Sherfy states in her book, the clitoris is so densely packed with nerve endings, there is hardly any room for a blood supply. It is the most nerve-sensitive organ in the human system, and it only exists in the human female. So, for the human to female to have achieved the ability to orgasm as you can today, multiple orgasms, meant that in prehistory, women were totally free, totally sexual, and were the aggressor. Would tell the man she wanted. Sex was over. And that was important because it increased the population. The more sex a woman had, the more she wanted sex, the more she would become pregnant, the more it would guarantee that the population would increase. But this was evolving besides the fact of reproduction. The clitoris evolved as a pure organ of orgasm, of pleasure, and nothing else. So if then Kinsey, studying this, came to the brilliant idea, something is wrong here. If we're looking at all these American women in the 1940s and not hardly any of them are having orgasms through vaginal sex, something else is going on. And he postulated, he didn't make a big deal of it. He didn't include it in the books he wrote, but he suggested maybe Freud was wrong. And maybe the vagina is not the height of female sexuality, but the clitoris could be. So then Mary Jane Sherfy got her degree, became a psychiatrist, specialized in women's problems, women's gores, and then she became aware that in the 50s, there was an article that was published in the Western Journal of Gynecology, written by a doctor named William H. Masters. And he was taking Kinsey one step further. Not only was he interviewing women, but he was doing physiological studies, actually measuring blood pressure, measuring temperature, measuring skin response, what's called the galvanic skin response, of a woman through her whole sexual experience. From beginning, from foreplay, if you might say, from stimulation to actual intercourse to orgasm. He studied the whole thing, and he recorded it and filmed it. He then got in touch with a woman who was very interested in his work, a psychologist named Virginia Johnson. They became Masters and Johnson. You're too young to remember. But when they came out with their report in the 60s, that was the sexual revolution. They said there was only one orgasm in woman. Only one. There was not a clitoral orgasm, and there was not a vaginal orgasm. The method, procedure, modality of how a woman comes to orgasm is the same every time. Has to include clitoral stimulation. Then it was said, okay, the women who would say that they could achieve orgasm thrust just through intercourse were clever enough to position themselves, to press themselves so that they still got clitoral stimulation. And they had orgasms that way. I know many who did.
Pro over here.
But you know what? The women, what he also found out, the women who orgasmed the most, who had the most healthy sexuality, masturbated very much as a young child and as a teenage girl, became in touch with themselves, realized that they could stimulate themselves to orgasm, didn't have to depend on a man to do it. That became the sexual revolution of the 60s. And that's when we had multiple partners, multiple experiments, and blah, 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 blah. The pill was invented. No longer did you have to worry so much about birth control, and that freed women up. Unfortunately, in the 80s and 90s, we've slipped back to where today, I'll bet there's still a lot of young girls, young women married in their 20s and 30s who don't have orgasms because the men are stupid. They don't understand. So.
Well, I just think men just didn't get educated, you know.
But let's explain why.
Okay.
We're going to go back now. Remember I said, in order for a human female to have achieved orgasm and the ability to have multiple orgasms. I was once with a woman who had 25 orgasms in the space of an hour. She had reached a point where just a touch, just a thrust, she continued to orgasm. I
have gotten up in that category.
We're gonna talk about
a Taurus. I'm a Taurus. I have 5 kids. Definitely a very highly sexual person.
It was a Tauran woman that I was with who had Aries rising, who had Mars
Leo
in Aries.
rising.
Right. Well, see, you have the fire to be able to bring you there. She could have multiple. She could have a zillion orgasms.
Yep.
And I've also been with a woman who only could have one.
And by the way, the reason I can say it out loud and I'm public is because I'm happy and proud of it. I don't want to be shameful of that.
That's why I'm going to share my experiences. I'm not ashamed.
Good.
To say that I had homosexual experiences when I was young.
Good
and
for
that we knew that we know now that human beings are born innately bisexual.
They should be. All humans should be bisexual. I don't understand why they're not.
We're going to go there.
Okay.
Again, we started out saying you would not have evolved the ability to orgasm if it had just been for reproduction. If just a penis coming in your vagina was enough and you had no knowledge of your clitoris, you would have never achieved the knowledge of orgasms. So what happened? This means that primitive women, I'm talking about this, 100,000 years ago, 200,000 years ago, 500,000 years ago, knew that they had orgasms. And developed orgasms and developed techniques. This is why it was women who started the practice of having face-to-face sex, not men. Men still wanted to mount from behind, which they still do today. Men still get much more off of coming from behind than they do from the front because it's very primal. It's very masculine. You feel like a bull, like a stallion. But the greatest experience is going to happen face-to-face, usually with a woman on top, not on the bottom.
We're not going to mention certain cultures are more prone to this than others.
Oh, yes, we are. Yes, we are.
No, we're not.
Yes, we are.
Okay.
Because we have developed an incredible panoply of sexual experience. That's the point. We would not have the ability to hear all the different things that humans do sexually if it was not once a free, open experience. So you wanted to know the point. We told you the point. You asked me, were women free in Kemet? That was the whole story of matriarchy. It was obviously known by ancient men that women were superior sexually. And they went along with it. Because women would tell them where to stand, where to sit, where to move, touch this, touch that, use this, use that, stimulate me here, touch me here, when they were more open. Women don't talk about that today. Again, well, this is before Judaism, but before Judeo-Christian Islam, okay? So, normally, 50,000 years, Neanderthal, early Homo sapiens, were all matriarchal. We're all matriarchal. It was early recognized by early humans that women were superior and women were in charge. So the sex act was always controlled by women for millions of years. Not thousands of years, millions of years. So then what happened? What was the change? Kemet. Women were free. I told you, I went back to all of my research. That's why I got all my books laid out here. The book that I told you about, When God Was a Woman, she has a whole chapter on the sexual practices in Kemet. How free they were, how open they were. Because there was no, patriarchy had not come in full into Egypt, into Kemet, to change the idea. Women were in charge. Women, descent went from mother to daughter. Women were to naturally be pleased and served. So you can be sure that Cometian women, 5,000 years ago, had more orgasms than women have today. On the universe. In other words, taking the whole world
also
population.
that psychological freedom.
So, here we come to the Hanuti, to the early patriarchal fathers. We told you. How could they change the system? They wanted to develop a system of patrilineality, father to son. So therefore, you had to know who your father was. This was unknown in Kemet, as I told you. The biological father was not important. Women chose, in other words, women, well, let's go back, say 1800 BCE, a typical temple of Hathor, where women were. Women, again, there was not much the nuclear family. Most women were raised in the temples. Most women were raised in the women's tribe, clan, and groups. So women knew that sex was for pleasure. They developed all the pleasure techniques, all the ideas, which we're going to discuss when we get into the who am I, because I had very many experimentations in sexual tantra. Tantra today, practiced by India, by Asia, and in Egypt. Tantra is the practice of sexuality for itself, for pleasure, extreme pleasure, and develops techniques which I learned for the male to hold back so that the woman comes first. So we're going to go into that. We're going to go into that when we get to the who am I, because I'm going to tell my personal experiences and your personal experiences. But for here, these fathers, the men are now coming in and they want to devise a system where the women are no longer in control. So female sexuality cannot be free. It cannot be totally open because you'll never know who the father is. Again, I return to Hakim. Hakim used to love to tell this story. And I think I told it already, we'll tell it again. He would say, you know, my mother, she is 100% sure I am her son. But my father, you're never sure. You're never sure. Especially with a woman that's been with multiple partners. But she knows. She always knows. When a woman becomes pregnant, she can be having sex with 50 men, but she will know which one is the father. Mm-hmm. That is your intuitive ability. It is innate in the nature of the female to know who the father is.
Yeah.
But it wasn't important in Kemet. The biological father, again, she would choose somebody whose traits, attributes she admired, she wanted in her child. She would conceive with that person, forget about it. Her child would be raised in the matriarchal clan. The male symbol, if it's a man, a boy, the male symbol would be her brothers, the males in the clan that are part of the matrilineal clan. That would be their role model, not the biological father. Okay, so now they want to create patriarchy. The father has to be the role model. So women's sexuality has to be controlled.
Control the women.
You want the point at the beginning? There it is. And how do they do it? By making the free sex of the female, the devil.
Yep.
Evil. Evil. I
Yep.
told you the church father, St. Augustine, just following up, said, the gates of hell lie between the woman's legs. So it starts with the patriarchal fathers. Women can only have sex to procreate. That's all the purpose of sex is. Men can have all the pleasure they want. We'll have multiple wives. We'll have all the sex we want. We'll screw and put out as many children as we can because that brings up the patriarchal clans. We want more male children than female. In fact, we'll even invent the concept of infanticide, which did not exist in Kemet. There was no such thing as an illegitimate child in Kemet. Every child born of woman was legitimate. You didn't have to know who your father was. But here come the patriarchal fathers saying, if you don't know who the father is, the child is illegitimate. And we want more males than females. So if too many female babies are born, we'll take them out and we'll put them in the woods for the animals to get. Murder! Patriarchy! Murder the infant child, the female, because we want more males. So that's where it starts. So then it has to be determined that sex only exists for procreation. So therefore, a woman must not have sex until she marries. There was no marriage before that. Now we're going to have a formal ceremony where a woman will be endued to a man, take his name, live with his tribe, and that begins patriarchy some 5,000 some odd years ago. Certain core civilizations much more into it than others. The Persians first, then the Greeks, then the Romans, and of course then the Jews. After they leave Kemet, they become very patriarchal. They want to change everything there was for their Kemet. So the woman becomes the devil. They worship the cow goddess, Hathor, it's in sin. And everything. So the woman then, Lilith, the original woman created, the story gets moved to Kabbalah. They take it out of Torah. The story that's in Genesis now is, oh, he's lonely. He needs a helpmate. So put him to sleep. We'll take out a rib. The original Hebrew word did not even mean rib. It's a totally made-up story. And she's to be subservient. Eve is the mother of all modern women, to serve man, to have his babies. So we go on to, you then go on to the civilizations, and then Islam, Judaism leads to Christianity. Christianity then says all sex is evil. We only do it for procreation. The mother of God was only a virgin. She only had sex to have a baby. And women are called prostitutes. The first time the word appears is in Judaism. Wait,
let's go back. The first time the word
prostitute appears is in Judaism.
And
the word comes from an ancient word, Kadishtu. It meant holy woman, sacred woman. The women who served in the temple of Hathor, sexually served the goddess, the female netter, were considered special, holy, sacred.
Don't they still practice that in India?
Oh yeah. Well, it's all prostitution today. I mean, there's still some. Again, this was revived in the 70s where women brought back the goddess imagery and goddess myths. This is when matriarchy began to be studied again. Again, female women anthropologists brought back the subject of matriarchy in the 70s. That's how I caught up with
where
it.
Osho got started.
Yes. Yeah, the sex guru, right? The sex guru. Okay. So, no, it's just the early father. Again, Islam takes it to its extremist degree.
It's unbelievable that the word prostitution derived at that time.
So you imagine now there's a couple of thousand years. If you talk about the beginning of Christianity 2,000 years ago, that's the beginning of rabbinical Judaism. Then a couple of hundred years later, Islam, around 700, 800 AD, Islam. So we're talking 1,200 years to 2,000 years. We're constantly taught all European cultures, all Asian cultures, all African cultures, when they become Muslim, and of course all American cultures, are taught that patriarchy is the rule. Men are the only ones that enjoy sex. Women are not to enjoy sex. If they do, there's something psychologically wrong with them. That's how Freud begins his whole psychoanalysis. Women are damaged. Women are ill because they, well, we don't know why, but because they can't transfer from the clitoris to the vagina, so they're infantile, so they have to be treated like little children. They're not to have any rights, not to have any rules, not to have any freedoms. that was the rule we grew under. That's what your grandmothers, my grandmothers, great-grandmothers, great-great-grandmothers, they all grew up under that rule.
Yep.
And if they enjoyed sex, they were never to talk about it.
Right.
Never to say that they enjoyed it. Not
I
supposed to.
have 4 daughters from 14 years old to 27. And when I'm finished with this video, I'm sending this video to them. I want them to know about all of this. I'm so grateful for this conversation. I've been
Well, now we go to the 70s, because here's where the revolution comes.
Mm-hmm.
Here's where Masters and Johnson say to the world, there's only one orgasm, and it's the clitoris. The clitoris is the sexual organ in women. Women start masturbating like crazy. There was a woman named Judy Chicago. She was a famous artist. She would draw pictures of women masturbating. All sorts of erotic art comes out in the 70s. Women masturbating, women having group sex, having sex. Again, bestiality is discovered, sex with animals, which happened in Kemet, was a natural form. And so the 70s bring the sexual revolution where we had. But there was a backlash. The backlash comes in the 80s and 90s that this was immature because people were having just sexual relationships and not having love relationships. Divorce became big in the 70s and 80s where women, my mother would never think of divorcing, my grandma would never think of divorcing, but women starting divorce. Like you have.
You know, one of the biggest pop culture queens of the sexual revolution is Madonna, who was my idol and still is. And you can see her influence on me, by the way. But she is the one who opened my eyes to this conversation.
My wife was very big into Madonna. Yeah. Well, really the one who did it was, if you want to, was Betty Davis, because she outdid you. She had 7 marriages. So a lot of these Hollywood women who were very sexually free, they couldn't stand with one man. They had multiple.
Elizabeth Taylor.
5 times. She had the same as you. 5 times. She married Burton 3 times. She married Richard Burton, divorced him, married him, divorced him, married him, divorced him, over time and time. Right. So, I mean, that's led to a lot of different practices. So what are we? Who are we? What are we? We are this advanced primate who lost the ability to have a cycle. No heat. Can be receptive all the time. And the idea that women can have multiple orgasms, and the idea is men can too. I'll talk about techniques of Tantra with you, where a man can develop the ability to have multiple orgasms. It is rare. I've had it only on few occasions.
I've read a little bit on this.
It can be achieved, where you actually have orgasms outside of ejaculating, where you ejaculate, the tension is removed, but you still have orgasm. You can continue to have, like a woman. I mean, I've had experiences with women that I've withdrawn, I'm done, I'm finished, and she's still laying there orgasming.
Yeah.
It still can, because as again, Masters of Johnson found, you get these tremendous contractions that they detailed the whole physiological experience of orgasm. It's not just genitally centered; it's the whole body experiences
the
orgasm.
Whole body.
It's good for the circulatory system. It's good for the endocrine system. It's good for the heart. It's good for the nerves. So in that way, Wilhelm Reich was right. The healthiest human beings are those that have a good diet. I'm vegan, but that's my bias. I'm vegan, but a good diet, healthy diet that builds the immune system, good sleep and rest, good exercise, and have a healthy, active sex life. Now, as you get older, that falls away. Rajneesh, who was another one of my favorites, Osho Rajneesh, he used to say, sex does fall away, drop away by itself, naturally, as you get older. But it's never because of repression. To repress it is to only bring psychosis, neurosis and psychosis. To repress sex, which is what religions do, nuns, priests don't have sex. You know, originally in Judaism, when Judaism was first evolved, men were to get married and have children, to have normal sex lives. It's only in Christianity that suddenly, and only in the Middle Ages, it wasn't even in the early days of Christianity, all of a sudden priests have to be celibate, not have sex. What does that lead to? Sexual perversion. It leads to all the homosexuality in the church.
I grew up Christian, and when I was a little girl, the neighborhood kids, you know, when we were under 9, we would all play with each other like that sexually, just for fun. I mean, it was so innocent. It was so innocent. Nobody knew anything. Too. You know, nobody knows what you're doing. You're just looking at body. You're looking at body parts.
I did too.
I would come home and want to share the experience with my mom and tell her. And I was like, I was excited because it was like, I got to see all this stuff today, this and that. And my mom was mortified and like, she made me feel really bad about myself, that I should be ashamed and there's something wrong with me. And then my dad got involved and he was really upset. And he's like, are you a lesbian? Is there girls there? Oh my God. And I'm like, oh my God, what is going on? I didn't know what was happening. I felt it was very normal, natural. I was just a little girl. It was all kids my age.
Which is what all kids do.
I didn't think anything was weird about exploring your own bodies. I thought it was very normal and loving and healthy. Even at that age, I knew there was nothing wrong with it.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right. I was 10 years old. Well, I had a little girlfriend, and we said, you got this, I got that. Oh, look, it's different. But see, but boys are taught that the first time you see a woman's genitals, you're taught to believe something's wrong, something's missing. She's damaged. She's got something missing. There's just an empty hole there where it's supposed to be an organ. And so something's wrong. She's lesser than you are. So when I grew up in the 50s, there always would be the insult. When you wanted to insult a girl, you call her a lessie. A lessie. Right. And even I grew up with the homosexual tones, calling somebody a faggot.
Yeah.
I mean, that was a put down of another male. You called him a faggot before you even come to understand. But you see, when I first started going through puberty, I had homosexual experiences. And so that made me realize that it's not all that terrible. So I never grew up with an unhealthy attitude towards gay people. When I became an adult, I oriented towards women. I found a woman's body more erotic, more sexual. I became heterosexual, but I never had any doubt that we're bisexual by nature, and that there was nothing wrong with gay men, and there's certainly nothing wrong with gay women. In fact, I have found the most active sexual women I've been with, the most profound sexual women I've been with have been bisexual.
Yeah.
My wife is bisexual. She was actually, she wouldn't mind me saying this. She actually lived as a lesbian for 25 years.
Wow.
And then decided, but she had sex as a kid. As a teenager, she'd had sex with a male. She got pregnant and had to give her child up. It's a whole long story. And so she'd had sex. It wasn't that she never had sex, but she went totally as a radical feminist in the 70s and was a lesbian. She came out of it, decided she could have sex with men again, met me, and here we are together.
Lucky
but in
you.
my life,
in my
life, now we're getting to who am I? Because I've hung around with artists all my life, all different types of artists, and men and female. Let me get rid of this here, it's annoying. Not now, okay? Later. All right. And there's no more sexually free people than artists. Musicians, artists, dancers, actors, always bisexual, there's gay and bi, pan all over throughout, and trans people all throughout acting. And I've got involved in a professional theater group. So, I mean, besides my own experiences, I've had the experiences of many others to go on, to know that we are innately bisexual. Again, I said women in Kemet were pansexual. They could be, as I used to say, with a crocodile, with a doorknob. It doesn't make a difference. I mean, and dildos were used in ancient Kemet. Now, we know that just using a dildo to penetrate the vagina is not going to give you an orgasm. Cleopatra had one. She had one made out of onyx. They were made out of rare metals and gold and stones that were very powerfully magnetic. But you know that they manipulated their clitoris. They had to use it. But women invented dildos. And they were used in Kemet.
Women invented dildos, I'm not surprised. What I'm the thing that I am the most hurt as a woman at 47 years old, the thing that I'm the most hurt is that, you know, in my particular sign, I'm geared to want to be sensual all the time.
The most sensual of signs are Taurans.
So what happened was my whole life, I've been ridiculed and made fun of or like oppressed that I wanted sex too much, or I enjoyed it, or I was too free, or I was always made to feel there was something wrong with me.
I'm glad you brought that up, because what Mary Jane Sherfy talks about in her book, what is found is what is normal human sexuality is female sexuality. Again, every mammal, every human starts out as female. What they have found is that women are much more reactive to male hormones, androgens, than men are to estrogens. Now, you know when a person becomes trans, so it's much more difficult for a man to become a woman than it is a woman to become a man. Why is that? It seems like the opposite. Because women are naturally activated by male hormones. So in other words, the so-called male sexual drive is actually female. So it is the woman that should want more sex than the man. Not only
That's
that,
really
of
good
course,
to hear.
no, from primality, from evolution. Because she wants to continue the species. She knows she creates in her body. She gives birth to the child. She's the one to perpetuate the race. So the more sex I have, the more babies I can have. But again, you know, she can have more year round. So that makes her also subject to predation. So that gives then the male, the androgens, the testosterone of a male will more for protection than for sexuality. For being the macho, big strong. No, the extra muscularity, the extra males, the extra strength and drive were protecting, to protect the female, not just to be a macho male.
That's the young energy.
So that's why we form social groups. Women and children had to be protected, which is what gorillas do. What is all the silverback? He's the head of the tribe. I mean, everybody listens to the male silverback. He's the man. He's the boss. But she only keeps him around to protect her and give her babies. If you know, the lioness is the one who hunts. Well, females were the ones who foraged. They didn't depend on the man to go out and hunt. You know, we have that mythology, male the hunter. He goes out, he hunts, he brings back the food. The woman's there. Oh, my good man, you brought back the food. I cook it for the children. That's just in the last couple hundred years. That's nonsense. Women foraged, women hunted, women gathered, women controlled the food. Men were just there for protection. Protect me and protect my babies. But she knew that the act creates a baby. And she also knew very quickly that the clitoris was her organ. And women masturbated from time immemorial. And then they taught men how. The first woman that said, man, you lay on top of me face to face was a woman. The first one who determined face-to-face sexuality was a woman. The first one who taught a man how to make love to a woman was a woman, of course. And that's my key message to every man that's listening. You have to go into the act of sex as a student. Every woman has to teach a man.
You're going to make me cry.
Every woman has to teach a man how to make love to her. Because women are different. There is a general pattern, a general way, of course. But every woman likes to be touched differently, likes the visual differently, the senses, all the senses. Women always have to have the senses, smell, touch, taste, feeling. How is your heart feeling? What does your heart say to me? You have to be somehow, I want to know that you care for me as a person, not just as a vagina, blah, blah, blah. All of that has to be taught. Men have to be taught to make love. Women know it.
Is that from their programming? Is that programming? Or just not taught, or
they're not taught. Men are not taught how to make love.
Yeah, I mean, most men.
That's why I got into Tantra, because again, even through 5,000 years of patriarchy, I always, again, like I did the first time we talked about matriarchy, I always like the yin yang symbol, right? In the light, there's a spot of darkness. In the darkness, there's a spot of light. That means in every cycle, there's always a reflection of the other. So even in the darkness of patriarchy, there is the light that there were those who kept the knowledge. That became the sexual practices, the tantra groups, the different cultures that worship female sexuality, like is in certain tantric cultures. But they were the obscure, they were the outsiders, the outliers of normal patriarchal development, which taught that female sexuality was inferior and had to be controlled. And therefore you had to have all these rules, all these laws, who you could make love to, who you could sleep with, and you can't be this, you know, again, you can't be your brother, your sister, that's incest. Well, incest existed in Kemet. Here we go back. Why did
many countries had incest, obviously, until recent times.
Well, why did men marry supposedly consort with their sisters? chosen in Kemet.
And also
It
royal
was for
families kept the bloodlines.
It wasn't for sexual reasons. It was political reasons.
Right.
Because the woman was the per-ah. She's the one determines who's the ruler, who's to be the king, the Horus. So men had sex with their sisters, full sisters, half sisters, so that they would have babies. So there was a lot of incest in Kemet. And it did lead to certain diseases which do get carried sexually. Hemophilia is one that get carried through incest. So that's one of the scientific reasons that were given that we should not practice incest, that we should mate hetero outside our crew, outside our tribe, outside our group, so that we have a bigger gene pool. But that's not the reason. We had a big enough gene pool because, again, women were sexually free to choose a male outside their group, outside their clan, and have children with them. So the sexual pool did increase naturally. But under patriarchy, it was restricted. You could only make love to someone you were not related to, was not of your father's tribe, because that's incest.
Next week or next, I hope we carry this conversation on next week.
But definitely, we still got a long way to go.
Okay, wait, I'll tell you exactly where I want to go with this. Is there's a lot of very convoluted, very tight matrix type of thinking where women today feel, objectified, the media, etc. And then there's women feeling there's a sexual empowerment. So like certain singers, like hip hop singers and stuff who are putting sexuality out there in your face. And then you have people who are trying to protect women and children who from pedophilia. And then you have this big uprising of fear. And then you have women who are trying to say, I'm an individual. I choose sexuality for myself. It has nothing to do with anyone else. I'm just enjoying my body.
That only started in the 60s.
Oh my gosh, there's such a swirl. And I'm at this stage in my life where I've tried everything already. I've done the repression, and then I've done the aggression, and then I've done the yin, and then I did the yang. And then I realized, coming full circle, that I really enjoy being in my yin. My yin is far more rewarding to me because it's receiving. So I get all the joy and beauty and everything from the receiving. And I love seeing my husband in his yang energy.
Which I like the photograph you posted. Yes, I saw the photograph. It was beautiful. Yeah, well, because the most realized males have a very strong feminine.
Yeah. Well, I call him a goddess. I call my husband a goddess because he's male, female, and beautiful.
Like Hakeem would say, my mother, 51% feminine, 49% masculine. I, 51% masculine, 49% feminine. There's only 1%. And then 1% is the plumbing. And the plumbing.
But do you think you have the guts to tackle this next week? Because it's a very complicated matrix.
I've been doing this for 30 years. There's no guts. I was lecturing on this subject in the 80s. I mean, I'm a liberated man. I realized in the 70s, first of all, I was inexperienced. Again, so we're starting the who. We'll start a little bit of who before we go to next week. I was very inexperienced sexually. I was very shy. I had a Sagittarius with Mars and Leo. I had a very strong sexual drive. I masturbated since I was 12, 13. I first experienced it, at 15, I was an insane masturbator. I would masturbate 4 or 5 times a day. I mean, I had a class in sexuality when I was a graduate student. This was from women's studies class, a class in female sexuality, where we had to keep a sexual journal. And this was some of my most active years of all the sexual experiences we had, either masturbating or having sex with someone or heterosexual, homosexual, whatever. So I once recorded that I masturbated 9 times in one day.
Well, you have to drink a lot of water if you're going to do that.
Well, you're also going to get very sore. Very sore. And it's
very sore and dehydrated.
But the drive is that strong. I had a very strong. And again, I'm going to talk to older men because, as Rajni says, it does. You see, I can talk about it now totally objectively because I'm not so subjectively involved anymore. I mean, I still have sexual feelings. Sexual feelings never disappear. But the ability to have an erection disappears. I used to love to tell this story. One of my favorites was Groucho Marx. Absolutely loved it. One of the great, not only comedians, but social philosophers of the 20th century. So he lived to be his late 80s. So he was around 88 years old. And he was going to be honored in Hollywood. He was going to get this great award. So all the other great actors and comedians were all going to gather. It was going to be a great event. So they naturally assumed he was going to be very excited. But when the reporters came to interview him, he wasn't excited at all. And they could, why? What's the matter? So he just looked in the camera and said, I give it all up for one erection.
Oh my gosh.
He's 88 years old, meaning he still remembers what it was like to be sexual. We never forget. But you lose the ability.
That's why you have Cialis and all kinds of...
No, that's phony. That's false.
No, but it works.
The best means of erection that I ever found were a woman who was wet and hungry and really wanted me. There was no more turn on, no chemical, believe me, there's better things than Cialis. There are Chinese herbs. There's one called Li Shi Shen extract. We'll talk about it. You can have an erection for hours. You don't lose your erection after ejaculating. These are Chinese. Again, let me end on this point. Let me end on this point. It didn't start in the 60s. It didn't start with Freud. We have had throughout the 5,000 years patches, periods, where people rebelled against this and had free sex societies. It was in the 1840s in the US, in the 1880s again. It erroneously taught that the first woman who ran for president was Susan B. Anthony in 1876, and she was arrested. Wrong. When I was doing my master's degree in women's studies, I took a class in women in US history. And I did a paper on a woman who ran for president in 1872. Her name was Victoria Claflin Woodhull. And what was the platform she ran on? The Free Sex Party. She was very much a libertine. She had many husbands, many lovers. And she was advocating that for all women. Because women couldn't even vote. So how could she run for president? So of course she was arrested. But this is before Susan B. Anthony. So there were movements. There's what's called the movement around Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton were a lot of lesbians. There were a lot of lesbian movements that wanted free sexuality for women. So it didn't just start with Freud, and it didn't just start in the 60s. But the sexual revolution in the 60s and 70s are really what sprung all the literature we have, all the medical backing now, instead of just ideas that women can have free. But
well, I also...
there's always been points where a woman like you, whether you would have been born in 1820 or 1760, that you might have rebelled against it and formed a group of women who were into free sex. Because it did happen throughout history, but they were isolated, of course, groups that didn't impact the larger culture.
Well, next week, I also want to drop in, maybe we can discuss a little bit about harems and multiple partners with one male.
Sure.
You know, because that's just throughout history.
Right. But
so this is very intoxicating,
there
exciting.
There also were times when women had multiple partners, but that isn't talking.
Oh, women had harems of men?
Well, they had lovers. They had lovers.
They had lovers.
They were known to have many lovers.
Men have a hard time, I think, being in the same room together, like that.
Well, we'll also have to discuss jealousy and possessiveness.
Well, because, you have that yang energy, and it's really, about protection, and it's not natural.
Well, it's misunderstood. That woman is, again, the idea that the woman is your property. You own her. So if some other man is with her, he's stealing your property. It's not sexuality. It's stealing your property. So, and I had to deal, any man that's been in an open relationship, and it's been with a woman that had more lovers besides himself, has had to deal with jealousy and possessiveness. I had to deal with it. I've been with women who were jealous and possessive of me, thinking that I had other lovers. So we'll discuss that. We'll go into that.
Sounds great. This was really informative.
We did the what am I? We come from mammals to primates, to Homo sapiens who are advanced. And the reason why we are different than other primates and other mammals is not because of the big brain, it is because of the clitoris. Boom.
Woo!
So the clitoris.
Bow to the clitoris.
We did not know anything about it until Masters and Johnson. That's the amazing thing. It was known, the organ was known. It was known that women derive pleasure from it, but it was thought to be infantile, that only a little girl plays with her clitoris. When a woman becomes mature, she moves away from the clitoris to her vagina, and that was the prevailing thought until Masters and Johnson.
It's incredible.
Yeah.
Absolutely incredible.
There's only one orgasm you have. Whether you have it through orgasm, through vaginal sex, or you have it through masturbation, it's all the same orgasm.
Well,
okay, that's how we can leave it.
A lot of people. Thank you so much, Stephen. So we'll just see you next week.
Okay, and I'll send you and a lot of ladies probably are listening, might be interested. I'll send you all the detailed information. It's called The Nature and Evolution of Female Sexuality.
And also that herb.
She was gonna write 2 volumes. She only wrote 1 to show you that it was not well received, even in 1972.
Wow.
Mary Jane.
What was the name of that Chinese herb?
Li Shishan extract. I'll send it to you.
Yeah, I'm sure a lot of people would be interested in that.
You can get it from Chinese herbalists, but it's
Wow.
dangerous. It's dangerous. As a friend of mine said, he took it and he went to work and he had to fight all day at work for hiding an erection coming out of his pants.
That's awesome. Okay, great.
A word of caution. But Cialis, Viagra, no. That's phony shit. That's garbage.
That's awesome. I love talking to you, Stephen. We'll talk next week, okay?
Okay.
Much love.
Namaste.
Bye-bye.